Hello there, and welcome to FoodShare's Winter Garden Shutdown Workshop with me, Natalie Bested, FoodShare Toronto's Community Garden Coordinator. Thanks for joining me today. So before we get started, I'm just going to do our FoodShare Indigenous Land Acknowledgement, what we do before all of our presentations and workshops. So FoodShare acknowledges that the sacred land in which we operate is situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands around the Great Lakes. FoodShare recognizes the many nations of Indigenous people who presently live on this land, those who have spent time here, and the ancestors who have hunted and gathered on this land known as Turtle Island. FoodShare recognizes and supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, applying both to our work. FoodShare's work is guided by principles of food justice, and this includes receiving ongoing guidance from an Indigenous advisory circle on our work and collaborations with Indigenous groups working towards Indigenous food sovereignty and increasing Indigenous food access. So today we are going to be talking about putting the garden to bed for winter. And so we're going to think about some techniques and strategies, none of which should cost you very much money, for really shutting your garden down very well in order for us to have the best possible garden scenario for the next year. So why do we do this? Why do we shut down the garden properly? It's going to help us reduce pests, disease, and weeds. It's going to prepare our beds for easier planting in the springtime, very important. Maintain and improve our soil quality, probably the most important reason we do all of this work now. And we might be able to begin planting and harvesting earlier in the season, in the springtime, if we do all of this good work now to get it shut down properly. So something we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about when we want to really shut down our gardens and make sure everything is removed from our gardens is the first and last frost dates. So the last frost date, so that's the last time we're going to maybe experience frost in the season, is May 11th. So that tells us when we can usually start our gardening season. And so similarly, not surprisingly, the first frost date, November 1st, so the first time in the season we're going to start experiencing frost again, that's the time we want to make sure we have most of our food harvested from our garden, unless it's really cold tolerant. And so this is also the time we want to be shutting our garden down. So around that November 1st date, give or take a couple of weeks, is when we want to start shutting things down. And frost dates differ each year and by region to region. So you can check the Farmer's Almanac online. Just Google Farmer's Almanac and your region, and it'll tell you those first and last frost dates for each year. So even though we are pulling up a lot of our produce for the season, it's not too late to plant now for a head start on spring crops. So we can plant things that are going to come up in the springtime now in the fall. They're going to be dormant. This is a really good time, kind of that window between October 31st or October 20th, I'd say, and November 10th or so is a great time to plant seedlings for next year. They're going to remain dormant in winter, as I mentioned, and they'll come up early in the springtime. A lot of them are going to potentially die off in the winter. It'll be too cold for them, which is why we overseed. So we add more seeds than we think we're going to need into our bed because we know we're going to lose some over winter. But then as soon as it's warm enough and they have the right conditions in the springtime, these guys are going to pop up for some earlier crops, which is really great in spring. We want to make sure we cover these up so that they're not getting blown away or washed away with the snow and the wind from wintertime. So these are going to be pretty heavily mulched. And in the springtime, you shouldn't have to remove the mulch, but if it's gotten really thick over the winter and really compacted, you might want to fluff it up and space it out just a little bit, but they can still stay mulched in the springtime. Another thing we can do as we prepare our beds for shutdown is transplanting. So we can transplant perennials in the fall. This is a great time to do it, especially for things like fruit trees and berry bushes. So here we've got some strawberries, we've got blackberries, maybe you got some fruit trees you wanted to plant. So this is a great time to do that. They're starting to go dormant, so we're not disrupting them too much. They are slowing their growth period down. This is a great time to do that. So again, anytime, kind of October through November, we can do these transplantings. Another thing we want to do is we're going to clean up our tools. So this is something to do after everything's been done. We're going to remove and disinfect our stakes, our trellises. We're going to try to protect our pots from freeze thaw and breakage over winter by turning them upside down, making sure there's no excess water left in them if they're just sitting around. We'll drain our hoses. We'll disinfect our other tools using just vinegar or soap. And this is a great thing we do over the winter time. Make sure that next year, whatever we're using is not going to cause disease or infestation in the plants that we're using next year. Another thing we can do is pruning our perennials. So this is a good time for us to prune certain kinds of perennials. So basically, things here we grow in North America would be fruit trees and raspberry and blackberry canes, very specifically. We don't want to prune our woody herbs in the fall. It actually promotes growth on the herbs, and they're trying to go to sleep. So we don't want to wake them up with this with pruning. Similar for roses, we want to wait until the springtime. But for our perennial fruits, like our blackberries and our raspberries and some of our trees, we can go ahead and prune those. So whereas in the summertime, we may prune the top of our raspberry, blackberry canes to get them to stop growing. Once the fall hits and they've lost most of their leaves or they're looking dormant, we can cut off all the additional dead stems that are pretty noticeable, and we can cut those off, and it'll allow lots more space for new canes to shoot up in the springtime. So that's nice to get rid of all that bulk of all the canes that are kind of spent, and you'll see the difference between the green and the dark canes. Another thing we can do is remove harmful plant materials. So once our season is over, we've harvested everything we're going to, we want to make sure that we take out as many things that potentially could harbor diseases and pests as possible. So the pests that love to eat your particular kinds of vegetables you've been growing, they usually are going to be leaving their eggs, or their larvae on the plants to grow over the season or to go dormant in the winter season and come up in the springtime and eat those plants that they think are still going to be there. And so it's really important for us to get rid of all of the stems and the sticks, any debris of that plant. You want to be able to compost that, especially if you also see that it has some kind of disease on it. So not just pests, but also bacterial or fungal disease on the leaves. You'll be able to notice that, I'm sure, throughout the season. And so it's really important to remove that. If your plant does have a disease, a visible foliage disease, you don't want to put that in your compost bin. You want to put that in the garbage or the leaf compost for the city to come and pick up. And this is a really important step. If your plant was fairly healthy, no particular signs of diseases or pests, you may be able to simply let it die on the soil and act as a little mulch and compost at the same time. But most of the things that we grow in our garden, we do actually want to remove just to make sure there's no pests and diseases being harbored in the soil over the winter season. So as I mentioned, anything that looks like it has diseases, we want to put in the city yard waste or in the garbage. We don't want to put it in our own compost. Things we can leave, though, we don't want to have to pull out everything, so we can leave all our perennial vegetables and our perennial herbs and fruits. So the perennials are a massive variety of things we might have in our garden, but here's some common things. We would have our berry bushes and trees, maybe rhubarb, chives and other herbs that are not as woody, our woody herbs like our sages and our oreganos, rosemary, lavender, all that kind of stuff, and asparagus. So these are the main things that we often see in our garden in a North American context that are perennials that we can leave. Here's some more perennial herbs that you guys can have a look at. You can kind of screen grab this or look at perennial plants online just to get a better sense of what you can leave in there. We can also leave our root crops up to a certain point. So if we have things like parsnips, carrots, beets, some rutabagas, some radishes, we can actually leave these a little bit longer even when the greens have started to die off because of the cold. Under the ground, the plants still have a potential to live on for at least a couple of weeks. So I would say by mid-November, you want to take out the remaining root crops that are in your garden. But if you haven't gotten a chance to eat them yet or haven't gotten around to them and you didn't need that many and you still have lots left, it is okay to leave them even once the tops die off in the winter and then harvest them as you need to until we get to the point, again, about mid-November, you want to harvest the rest of your root crops. Another thing we can leave potentially over the entire winter season, depending on whether you want to cover them up or not, are hardy greens. So there are a lot of leafy greens that actually don't mind the cold. So the main ones are kale, collard, Swiss chard, spinach, some cabbage. And a lot of greens actually become sweeter in the cold. So you can see here in this example, they've created a little hoop house over top of their greens bed, and the greens have enough heat, just enough heat there to be able to thrive. And so you can have greens potentially all season long if you do a hoop house over top of them. So it might be something to try and something to think about. You can also bring some plants indoors for winter. So a lot of people like to do this with peppers very specifically because they're not too big. You could do this also with eggplants, maybe with some beans if you have some at the end of the season. You can dig them up and bring them inside. And also some woody herbs like rosemary and lavender that don't really love the cold season, and some often die in our climate and we have to buy them again every season. So you may consider bringing those indoors. If you have a sunny location that is warm enough that they're going to be able to survive, you can't just bring them in and put them in a dark shed. They still have to have some kind of heat and light, but they will slow down in their growth. They may not look very good over that season, but if you can keep them alive, especially the perennial herbs, you can put them outside again in the springtime. For things like peppers, if you bring them in, you might get another couple weeks after them, or after you bring them in, maybe a month, but they are not perennial, which means they only actually have one growing season, so they're not going to last much longer than that, and that's totally fine. So the other thing we want to do now that we've pulled out our herbs, or we've pulled out our plants, we've left our herbs, we've left some of our perennial fruits in there, now we can prepare our soil for spring. So we're going to do that in a variety of ways. Let's have a look here. So we're going to till our beds if we want to, so that involves kind of turning our soil over. And what this does, it exposes the insects and larvae that might be living in there or that have been left there by their insect parents for next year to be eaten by birds and other animals. It helps reduce weeds. You're catching them in a dormant period or a slow period and pulling them out. That's going to almost ensure there's never a surety that there's a weed-free bed, but it's going to help knock back those weeds for next year. You're going to maintain the nutrients by making new nutrients available to the surface. And it's going to help to maintain the health of perennial plants also with that nutrient turnover. So one thing we can do after we've kind of turned our beds over is we can shape the beds. So this means raising the beds up so you create these soil mounds, which you can see here. And what that does, it's good to do it in the fall because in the spring it's quite wet from all of that moisture over the winter time if you're in a climate that has snow. So it's ideal to do the bed shaping in the fall so you save yourself that work in the springtime. Again, if you have a raised bed, you won't need to do this work, but if you have long rows of just soil, then absolutely go ahead and shape them. And the benefit of raised beds also is that they de-thaw quicker in the springtime because the sun is hitting them on all three sides, not just from the top. And so that actually warms that soil up a little bit quicker than if we just left it flat. So again, we want to weed. So when we turn our soil over, we're going to weed and take out as many weeds as we can. And, keeping in mind that if we are going to remove things like grass, it's good to try to get the entire root system. Otherwise, we break them off from the top and the roots actually grow stronger and they come back thicker, which is a real pain in the butt. Another thing you can do in the fall is called occultation. So this is really great if you're just starting a new bed or if you have a really weedy bed that you're really having issues with. So this is a process where you add black plastic or a dark tarp, totally a light barrier to the soil underneath. Usually we use black plastic in gardening. And so what's going to happen is the soil is going to get a little bit warmer underneath because the sun is going to be absorbed by the black, and the seeds underneath, all the weed seeds, whatever's there, are going to germinate, come up, but then they're not going to have access to light, and they're going to die off. So basically you're killing off any seeds that are underneath that black plastic. And earthworms also really love this environment, which is amazing because they're the things that are going to be creating really great soil. So not only are you getting rid of weeds and weed seeds for the next season, you are also making sure that you're attracting worms, which are going to produce really nice soil for you underneath there. So here's another example of people doing it on a large scale. So normally what you'd want to do is you would till, you would add compost, you can add some straw underneath, and then you add your black plastic. And so you're really working on a nice quality of soil underneath there, while at the same time getting rid of all the weed seeds. And then you'll pull this off in the springtime and you're ready to plant. So as I mentioned, you may want to add compost in the fall, depending on what your capacity is. If you have compost available, if you have budget for compost, it is nice to add some compost in the wintertime. And it'll help your perennial plants stay nice and healthy. It'll also make nutrients more readily available in springtime, and it'll have a longer time to break down and really get into the soil. So I would also say that, when you're adding, or if you choose to add compost or not, if you are not able to in the fall for whatever reason, financial or otherwise, you can add it in the springtime, or you can do both. So sometimes I find at the end of my year, I don't have budget left for compost for the fall. So what I'll do is I'll mulch, which we're going to talk about. And that is going to add a natural element of what will eventually be compost. It's going to break down on top of my soil over time while also keeping my beds nice and covered. But you can do both compost in the fall and the spring for the very best soil quality. So we don't want to leave our soil bare. So once we have our compost on top, we're going to want to cover our soil with something. So we're going to mulch, and you can do this in a variety of ways. So we already talked about tarps, which is the occultation. So we're going to talk about mulching and cover crops as the options for covering your soil. Mulching is one of the best things you can possibly do. You do mulching all year round in gardening. You mulch as much as you possibly can. It helps in so many ways. So mulching protects the soil from erosion. It's adding organic matter to your soil, which will break down over time, creating great soil quality. It's going to protect the perennials, things like garlic and newly planted bulbs or seeds, from extreme cold, and also from animals like birds eating your seed. So mulching really does so much for the garden, and you're going to do it all year round, but especially in the fall. So one of the main things we use to mulch in North American context are fallen leaves. This is an amazing free resource that you have probably in your front yard, backyard, or your neighbor's yard. And this is going to go on top of all of your beds, regardless of whether you composted or you didn't compost. You're going to put mulch on top of all of your beds. And you can shred the leaves with a lawnmower if you want. It'll help them break down faster, but you don't need to do that. So other mulches you can use are straw, which is a bit more expensive. The problem with straw is it often contains wheat seeds, or the seeds of the plant that has been made straw from. And so that can be really tricky. It's hard to get a truly weed-free or seed-free straw. But it does make a really, really excellent mulch, so we use it quite often. Whereas the leaves, they don't have any particular seeds in them, and so that's a really great option. And again, it's free. You can use coffee hulls. You can also use newspaper or cardboard, and then cover that up with leaves, straw, or wood chips, and this is called sheet mulching. So this is another option for completely covering your beds and making sure there's no light getting through, no way for the seeds underneath to actually germinate and come to fruition. So you are, again, helping to kill off some of those weed seeds underneath for next year. And with the newspaper, you can actually leave the newspaper or the cardboard on your garden bed and just cut holes into it and plant directly into the soil underneath in the spring if you just have little seedlings that you're transplanting. It won't work if you have seeds that you're direct sowing, because obviously you're not accessing the soil that's underneath, but you can leave it on if you are doing seedling transplants. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also plant a cover crop. This is something you would do in kind of late summer, early fall. So in September, you kind of want to have your cover crop on if you're going to do it. And this is a crop that is going to grow in this fall, and then it's going to die off in the spring, or die off in the winter. And as it dies off, it actually creates a complete cover for your garden bed. So it's doing the same thing as a mulch would do. It's just doing it more naturally with its own body. And then you're going to dig it up in the springtime and turn it into the soil, and it's going to become some organic matter. So for this time of year, I would say rye, also called winter rye, is the best option. There's a lot of other cover crops out there you can look at. Farmers use cover crops all year round to kind of give the soil a break or a rest if they're rotating their crops or their fields. But you can certainly do this in winter time. We talked about cleaning our tools from before. So again, using vinegar is a great cheap option for cleaning all of our tools. And you also maybe want to file and grind things down to make sure everything is nice and sharp for next year. And the last thing you want to do is make some notes. So wintertime is a great time to reflect on how the garden went, what worked, what didn't, and make sure that you're really aware and have a plan for next year as you go into that next growing season. And you want to do that now, because by springtime, you may have kind of forgotten some of those things that happened in this year, what was planted where, what worked, what didn't. So this is a great time to make those notes and start to really make that plan for next year based on what you learned this year. The last step, of course, is putting up your feet and enjoying the winter time. So I really hope you guys have such a great time shutting down your gardens this year. I hope that at the very least, if you do nothing else, please put that mulch on top. Don't leave the soil bare. And if you get around to all the other steps and stages and tips and tricks we talked about today, that's great. But the very least you want to do is put that mulch on. So I hope you had a great time. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with another workshop soon.